Good evening, and thank you for joining the Westerly Library in Wilcox Park for tonight's Author Talk. This program is being presented using the webinar version of Zoom, and attendees are joining in listening mode only. Please feel free to send any and all questions through the Q&A or chat feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to answer them within the time we have allotted. Please note that this program is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel at a later date. Should you get disconnected, simply use the link that was emailed to you earlier to get back into the program. I will now turn it over to our moderator for tonight, a member of the board of the Friends of the Library, Mary Weiss.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I appreciate that warm welcome to our audience this evening. As Amanda said, I'm a member of the board of the Friends of the Westerly Library in Wilcox Park. And this evening, we are so pleased to have for a second visit, Marie Benedict, who was with us last year, discussing her newest book. She is a critically acclaimed and award-winning author. She writes under two names, though, Marie Benedict and Heather Terrell. So to maybe address that mystery, which we may have other mysteries this evening to talk about, her full name is Heather Marie Benedict Terrell. Now, it's up to you guys in the audience to figure out which name goes where, but that's Heather and Marie's name. I can't tell you how excited we are to have you back, Marie, and to talk about a book that at first I was like, okay, a woman of science, let me get into this. Well, I think it discovered this evening that there are many aspects to this book that speak to most current events, actually, that are going on in the world today. I think I'll save this till the end because we have a surprise as to what may happen with Marie and coming back to the Westerly Library. It is especially fitting and timely that Marie join us on the last day of Women's History Month, which is every March, with her latest book, Her Hidden Genius, that was recently released on January 25th, 2022. This is a historical fiction novel that focuses on a woman named Rosalind Franklin during the latter years of her short life. She only lived 37 years. This book focuses on the time period 1947 to 1958. Franklin was a British woman of science who was a pioneer in researching the molecular structures of coal, DNA, RNA, and viruses. Let me just take a drink.
Absolutely. We all need our sips, don't we?
Thank you. When I first approach any book, and maybe it's a simplistic approach that I take, I first look at the cover.
I know.
Then I say, what's the title? Then how is the book organized? And read the opening paragraph. This either piques my interest, and if it doesn't, I move on. And that's what I'd like to start off with our structure of our conversation this evening, because this is what piqued my interest in your book, Marie. There's the cover. I find the cover of Her Hidden Genius to be strikingly vivid. However, upon closer examination, it seems that there is more to it than these bold colors. I see these little dots in different colors on the cover. Do those have any significance, Marie?
Oh, yes. The process of developing a book cover is so interesting to me. As a writer, I get to weigh in on the cover, but of course I have zero artistic talent, so I don't actually do it myself. There's a whole team of wonderful artists that get involved. But what's so interesting is we start the process, and it's collaborative, they ask me, any author, sort of for symbols and images and ideas that are meaningful to you with respect to the story or the themes. And of course, when you know the story of Rosalind Franklin, you know that she was, as you said, a brilliant British scientist who actually discovered the double helix structure of DNA, but had that discovery basically taken from her, all her research, all her data, without her knowledge or permission by one of her colleagues, and had it given to Watson and Crick, and we'll talk about that more later. So the double helix was what I said first was so important to me. I wanted to embody that somehow. So, and I'll have to back up a second a little bit about it, but if you look, so I had no idea what they were going to do in terms of it. And we got, this is actually the exact cover we got, and that doesn't usually happen. There is a double helix on the cover, but it's so subtle. I love it. It's really at her core, which I think is so beautiful. You know, it's centered to who she is and central to her legacy. But the dots that you asked about,
Yes.
and I'm going to be skipping ahead a little bit, but and pardon me if I'm going out of order, because I know you like your order, definitely.
A linear thinker. Yeah.
Yes, and I get that. But what's interesting about the dots is there's a famous photograph called Photograph 51 that Rosalind Franklin captured. She captured many important images. And when I say photographs, they're not photographs like you and I take. These are photographs that are captured through this laborious process called X-ray crystallography, which is still used today, in which a microscopic entity, a substance, is made crystalline, which is a whole difficult challenge in and of itself. X-rays penetrate that substance, and then those images are captured on photographic paper. They look like a bunch of little dots when you see them. They don't really look like anything, except if you are a brilliant PhD in physical chemistry and you know how to do X-ray crystallography, which is very hard to learn and it is considered one of the most difficult things to do in all of science. And that's what Rosalind did. She was an X-ray crystallographer. So what she captured was the double helix as embodied in photographic paper in these dots on photographic, and the famous Photograph 51 actually looks like an X, and it's considered one of the most important images in all of the history of science, and that X is actually indicative of a double helix. So that was a really long-winded answer to your question.
No, not at all. But the one thing what I'd like to address also to sort of complete that is the very vividness of the colors, because I've looked at Photograph 51 and it was just a black and white. So is there a deliberate message here by the vividness, the boldness of these colors on the cover?
I love this conversation. You know, this is the only time anyone has asked me about this cover, and I love it so much. I think it's such a great cover. Yes, there are two things. First of all, as I mentioned, the technique that Rosalind used was X-ray crystallography. Half of the image looks like an X-ray, right? Mm-hmm. So that is hinting at her, her methodology. And then the other is not, right? The choice of how to color this was in much debate. And actually, when I say this is the very first image, it was a little different. So the boldness, yes, that was chosen very intentionally, especially the blue. There was a sense that, this was a woman who had to be bold, who had to be strong to do what she did, to become a world-class scientist in this time period. You were overcoming so many barriers, and you had to stay strong and be resilient and tenacious. So we felt definitely we wanted that. Interestingly, though, in the very first version of the book, we prepare something called ARCs, if you're familiar with those. Those are advanced reader copies.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, those are prepared, excuse me. Some months before the book comes out, and they go out for review purposes and stuff like that. And generally they look exactly like the book. In this particular case, initially, this was pink. And there was such a backlash from booksellers and to the pink. It just seemed too, I don't know, maybe lighthearted for Rosalind. And we played with a whole bunch of other colors until the gold really seemed to strike out. Now, in my mind, it was sort of a nod to the fact she deserved that golden medal that she never got. Many people look at her life scientists and say, actually, she probably should have won 2 Nobel Prizes, but mostly it was because we got to look good together. But yeah, so there's so many layers of meaning.
Well, I'm glad I asked this question about the cover, because
That's
when I
exciting.
first looked at it, it was the colors that attracted me,
Yeah.
then the dots, and then you're sort of led into it. And the two predominant color themes sort of began to play on you, and you began to look at things. It's almost like taking an IQ test, It's like, well, what do you see in this picture? To go on to the second thing that attracts me to a book is the title.
Mhm.
Now, this title has 3 words.
Mhm.
And each of those conveys, I think, a real sense of what's going to be happening when you learn more about Rosalind.
Mhm.
Was that what you intended to convey when you wrote that title?
Yeah, I mean, titles are a very tricky thing. And again, it's part of the process that sometimes you go into the writing of a book and you know from the beginning what the title should be. Sometimes you think you know, but the rest of your team disagrees with you. And so there's a lot of debate. And sometimes you have a feeling for what it should be, but it's a joint effort. You really have to discuss it and collaborate. This was the latter. I had a feeling for what it was meant to be, what I was trying to convey with this story. Um, Again, the fact that she's sorry about that. I do not know how to turn things off on my computer. Despite the fact I write about science, I'm not great with technology. I'm always looking for hidden women of the past, right? Women whose stories, lives, legacies, contributions have been hidden. What's interesting about Rosalind is that there's really 2 different layers of hidden here. First is there's the hidden because women of that time, especially if you were a scientist, you were meant to be in the shadows and people really weren't going to push you forward. You had to make a name for yourself. But in Rosalind's case, there was very intentional hiding by the men in her world.
Yes,
Excuse me.
indeed.
There was this effort by her colleague, which is a whole story unto itself, by Watson and Crick at the time, and then for many years afterwards, to hide her genius, to hide the real truth behind the story of how the structure of DNA was discovered. And, we understand DNA today, but, writing this book, it's amazing. It was amazing for me to learn how little scientists understood about DNA at that time. They really didn't know what it did. They definitely didn't know what the structure was. They had a sense it had something to do with genetics and replication. They really didn't have a handle on it. But there was this general sense that it was one of those big scientific questions that if you could unlock the structure, you might unlock the secret. And so that all kind of came into play in the story of Rosalind and in the selection of the title.
So what our audience should recall is that her refers to a woman, hidden refers to some sort of suppression on whatever level, and
Yeah.
genius is a term that just aptly describes who she was and how she performed her work.
Yeah, she was true genius.
For some reason, I read somewhere that there's a difference in calling someone a woman of science and a female scientist.
No.
And I think there is a difference or a distinction between the two. And I think Rosalind would have preferred one over the other. Am I correct in that?
I don't know. I mean, that's a great question. I don't know that she would have. Let me put this back. I'm not saying she would, if she were alive in our day, she might have cared. Back then, I don't think she would have. I think she would have described herself as a scientist, plain and simple. No need for the female, no need for the woman of science. That she was, she was a scientist first and foremost. And to her, what was important wasn't gender, but how hard you worked, how smart you were, how much of yourself you were willing to give over to the task of discovery. That's what was important to her. I don't think she thought that gender really should have been part of it, although of course she realized that gender played a big role in how she was treated.
Well, that sort of naturally segues us into the topic of feminism.
Yeah.
And do you think Rosalind thought of herself as a feminist?
No, definitely not. I mean, I've become in fairly good touch with her family, her nieces and nephews. And she's a niece who's her namesake, Rosalind Franklin, also. And she and I had a whole conversation about whether Rosalind would have considered herself a feminist. And I think the answer is no. I think it's not that she would have been against the values of feminism. She more than anyone knew that women were capable of everything, right? And that there should be no barrier to entry in any field that a woman chose to enter. But I don't think she would have thought of herself as a feminist in the sense that that wasn't her flag to wave, right? Her goal, her passion, her focus, her really her calling was science. And I mean that in the way, like, not only that's just what she loved to do, but the Franklin family was very altruism, giving back was hugely important to the Franklin family. That's true then and now. And for Rosalind, as a scientist, her way of contributing to humanity was through scientific discovery, right? So that was the core of who she was. Did she think that women could do anything and everything? Absolutely. Did she think that women should have the ability to pursue whatever path they wanted? Definitely. But was she interested in singling herself out as a woman? Probably not. She probably just wanted to be treated like a scientist, like everyone else.
There is a strain in the book about her view as to whether or not a scientist,
Yeah,
a female scientist, a woman of science, could also be married and have a family.
yeah,
And
big
didn't
issue.
she have a very definite perspective on that?
Definite. I mean, she felt that you couldn't be a real scientist, like she was a real scientist. Her approach to science, it was in no way, shape, or form a 9-to-5 job, right? She was in all weekend. She was there late at night. If she had to go in at 3 a.m. because it was necessary for a science, an experiment, she was there. The way that she perceived science, it was an all-consuming career and passion. And she didn't see that, she found that to be mutually exclusive than having a family and being married. In her mind, that would take away too much from being a parent. She wouldn't, given her personality and given her approach to science, she couldn't effectively do both. Now, what's interesting is that, she had a mentor and a role model, Adrienne Weil. Adrienne is a fairly, she's a secondary character in the book, but she's a very important one. She was a Jewish refugee who came to England during World War II because of the persecution of the Jews once the Nazis took over France. She was actually a student of Marie Curie. And both women, both Marie and Adrienne, had husbands and had children. And they were, and Adrienne was probably the primary role model in Rosalind's life. So while on one hand, she had evidence of a woman scientist who could also be, a mother and a spouse, I think she thought that those were the outliers. That those two women, Marie Curie and Adrienne Weil, were able to do that only because they had very unusual husbands. That they had husbands who were fully supportive of their careers, put their wives' careers first above their own. And I don't think Rosalind saw that as a very common situation. Maybe if she had met somebody who she felt, who was willing and able to do that, she might have changed her mind. But she really did hold fast to that for a lot of her life. And I think part of that was her way of just putting that part of it aside and allowing herself to be sort of fully invested in her science.
But I do get hints in your book, or maybe more than hints, that she did bristle at certain treatment that her male colleagues would give to her.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, she definitely didn't want to be treated differently or worse because she was a woman. She was in the lab. She was a scientist. And why should she be treated differently than any other scientist, right? And she certainly was the brunt of some horrific sexism, right? So while on one hand, she did not want the differentiation in treatment, And the other, I don't think she saw herself as, a flag waving feminist. That wouldn't have been her part of her identity. But at the same time, she didn't think that there was any reason for there to be difference in treatment. And the sort of treatment that she eventually was subjected to by Morris Wilkins was so horrifically sexist. It's just mind-boggling. I mean, when you think of a toxic work environment, it would be, this would be like the definition of the worst toxic work environment.
I think the one thing that really got her set off, though, was when they called her Rosie. That just
hated that. It's funny, for all the things that they did to her, it was that nickname that really got under her skin. And I think it's because, first of all, it had a sort of flowery, light, not serious sort of sense to it. And she didn't want to be characterized in that way. And secondly, they continued to call her that once they realized that she didn't like it, probably because she didn't like it. And that really upset her too. They did so many horrific things to her in terms of treatment. Of course, the worst was taking her, but poaching her information and using it for their own purposes. But just day in, day out, it was a rough environment that she was in.
Yeah, like she had inferior laboratory space at times. They criticized how she dressed. She dressed professionally for a laboratory. She wasn't going to a tea party.
James Watson critiqued her as saying, instead of listening to what she was saying and as talking to her as a professional, he would say things like, she really needs to wear lipstick, or what she needs a better hairdo. That doesn't suit her. Would you say the same thing of a male colleague? You wouldn't even think about their hairdo. So that, that is the sort of stuff she was up against. And yet she persevered, right? Even in the face of this toxic work environment, even in the face of active attempts to really derail her and to critique what she was doing, she persevered until the end, till she finished the job and finished it well. She was never going to walk away from it. And that's one of the things I really admire about her is that quality of her.
Well, we go back to sort of my lineal approach to life.
Absolutely.
Your book is organized in 3 parts.
Yeah.
And I always am interested at how authors organize their books.
Yeah.
And it seems sort of the trend today to be in one time period, and the next chapter goes to a different time period, then you jump back to the prior time period. And a lot of our readers don't like that. So for those of you who like the linear approach, that's what you've adopted here.
I'm a linear gal.
But it seems that these 3 parts correlate to the different laboratories where she worked. Mm-hmm. And so that we can see the progression of her professional career by that. But the opening paragraph of your book, when she is at her first lab in Paris, and she was there beginning in 1947 to 1951, is very beautifully written. I won't read the whole thing, but it gives a sense of, and this is a dichotomy I think that comes in the book quite well, between the approach of the labs in France and the labs in the British, in the UK. And you describe how she's approaching this Paris lab. It's gonna be her first day on the job. And she had worked in a lab, I think was it during World War II, on the structure of coal, which many of us might think that's not a really exciting topic, but it truly was. It was very important to the war effort. But anyway, your first sentence was just amazing. A thin mist hovers over the Seine in the early morning. Strange, I think, it isn't yellow like the haze that floats over the murky Thames at home in London, but a robin's egg blue. Now, in my edition of that, it's italicized.
Yeah.
And I'm curious why it's italicized, because it's very beautiful prose, but why is it italicized?
You're in her head 100%. I mean, I write in the first person, so you're kind of always in their head, but sometimes it's a very specific thought that the person is having, rather than sort of a summary of how they were feeling. And that in particular, I wanted to bring the reader to that moment. She's out on the streets, brisk walking, this beautiful Parisian environment, and she stops, and this thought, this fully realized thought, really strikes her. And it's I wanted to bring the reader into that moment of not only starting this new job, but embarking onto a new place that she's living, and how different it's going to be, even in the smallest respects, how the rivers look in the city that you live. And of
The
course,
interesting part for me was here I'm in this reverie of the two rivers and the blue and the colors. And then the next couple of sentences, she talks about the water molecules. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute. What's going on here? The last sentence or the last phrase of that paragraph is very interesting to me. She describes how her father would describe that scene. Papa would call it heaven touching earth, but I believe in science, not God. Now, that's an important theme in this book too, because she came from a family that was a devout Jewish family, and she seems to have renounced religion and embraced science.
Yeah.
And what's going on there with that? Is she like rejecting her father, who was, a very dark? No, okay, well, maybe you could help me out with that. Then.
Yeah, no, it's tricky because she is such a dutiful daughter in many ways, so involved with her family life. So, when she's in England and even when she's in France, and I don't even include all the instances, she's constantly hosting her family. She writes her parents every single day. I mean, she is the quintessential dutiful child, and her family history, her lineage, those are so crucial to who she is. But as a scientist, it's all about the proof for her, and kind of back to that first paragraph, it's all about that paragraph is all about the precision with which she observes things, right? Crucial for a scientist, right? And then how she takes these very precise observations, and many people would be painting a glorious picture with it. She's thinking about the scientific underpinnings of it, and she's looking for the proof, the way things work, things that she can see and observe and measure, either through the naked eye, through her X-ray crystallography machine, or with the language and lens of science. And God is in something like that. And for her,
it was interesting, continuing this theme of the contrast between Paris and UK labs. And there was a phrase that you adopted, and maybe you could help us a little bit with this. If I'm giving away any spoilers, by the way, please tell me. Your description of Rosalind as a, quote, Parisian-styled scientist fitting into an English-sized hole.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
I looked at Rosalind. It was kind of like she was a puzzle piece looking for a place to fit, right? Here she is, this brilliant woman, right? So insightful, so diligent, so determined, so tenacious. And yet she has this other part of her personality, which is, she's very forthright. She speaks directly. She's down to work. And if she doesn't like your assessment of her work, she's going to banter with you. She's going to go back and forth. And all of that, the sort of way you interact, the way you approach the work, the zest with which you live, whether it's in the lab or socially, that was very French, but it was not very English. Oops, I think I lost Mary. Oh, geez. Hi, Mary, if you're out there.
Oh, no, Mary, where did you
I
go?
lost Mary. She froze for a minute and I was talking. I don't know if you could hear me talking.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll answer her question while maybe hopefully she'll hop back on.
Yes, definitely.
But yeah, so that when she got to Paris and arrived at this lab, this big lab full of bustling, engaged scientists, a lot of women, which was something she hadn't come across a lot, where debating how the sort of conclusion you might reach in an experiment, then going out to lunch and having a vociferous conversation over politics. She loved that. When she was in England, she was a blunt speaker, and she wanted to be able to debate something if as a scientist would, if it if there was a difference of opinion. And that was something when she was in UK labs. And then when she left Paris and returned to London to go and work at King's College, which is where she made her DNA discoveries, suddenly that was not an acceptable way to be in general, but specifically if you were a woman. We lost you, Mary, but I just continued talking.
I'm back. I don't know what happened. I just lost your connection. I'm terribly sorry. I don't want you to repeat, but I'm sure you carried on with a very good explanation of the Parisian style scientist fitting into an English size hole, which I thought was perfect. I think I know what it meant. So I don't want to repeat anything that you've already explained to our audience. I apologize for that.
Worries.
Yeah. To continue on, going back to this opening paragraph.
Yeah.
Now, if it were me writing that, that would take forever. I mean, that would be difficult. So does it just come to you, or you thought, this has got to work, I've got to keep at this? Did you write it after you finished the book? How did that process develop?
With that first paragraph, all the different scenarios you described have happened to me. You know, I have written books where I've only gone back after the fact and really, once I really understood everything and understood my character in the first paragraph, there have been times when I've played with it incessantly. This was one of those rare instances, which has happened before, where it all came to me at once in like 15 minutes.
Really? Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Had you started the writing of the book, or you just were thinking about it, or no?
I do. I had outlined it. You can imagine we're both lawyers. I had researched it. I had outlined it. I had my chapters, and I do keep, which is hard for me as an organized person. I keep a lot of wiggle room to see where the characters will take me, where the story will take me, where the research will take me, because I continue to research as I write, because you don't know what you don't know until sometimes you're in this. But I very often know where I want to start and where I want to end. That when I'm thinking about the story, I kind of always know where those two beats are. And I knew where I wanted to start with Rosalind. And, for example, I map things out. Like, I know what streets she was walking on. I know what would have been on those streets on that particular day. I research things like what the weather's like. But once I had that setting, the paragraph appeared. I can't describe it any better than that. That's like the best writing, is when it comes pure like that and easy.
Well, it must make you spur you on, because it's like, this isn't going to be such drudgery. Because I know a lot of times we do writing and it's just like, how can I get to the next section?
I know you're always kind of digging. That's why you keep writing, is to get that moment. There's a great book and this is an aside, by Michael Cunningham, called The Hours. It's about Virginia Woolf. It was turned into a movie many years ago, but he has a small chapter in there talking from Virginia Woolf's perspective about what it's like when it all comes together like that. And I've never seen it described so well as that. And it's like a golden moment. It just all comes together, and it's very easy.
It's like the perfect golf swing. It's like, oh, it finally happened. You mentioned earlier that you write in the first person narrative.
Yeah.
And what is the reason for that? Because not all historical fictions writers do that.
Most do not, actually. Very few people do it. For me, it serves a couple different purposes. For me, it's the only way when I write to actually feel as if I'm in my character's head. If I write in the third person, I feel such a distance from that character. It's hard for me to we talked about in that first paragraph. I describe a thought she has. Mm-hmm. It's hard for me to feel close enough to them to experience the thought, to have the thought. I feel like I'm an outsider looking in. Whereas if I write in the first person, I'm like inside looking out. And I feel much more able to feel what they might feel, to think how they might talk, and what they might be thinking about, why they make the decisions they make. And then I also feel like it brings the reader closer to the character. My goal with these women is for people to come into their lives, understand how they came to be these incredible women, understand and really live their lives through them, and for then the reader to come away with really a fresh perspective on things, a new way to look at the world. And the best way to do that is if you look at the world through somebody else's eyes.
Well, there's a new phrase that's come up, and believe me, I was not aware of this until I started doing a little background reading myself for our conversation. And there's a term called the Matilda Effect.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
Yeah, and it seemed to fit Rosalind so well. It's a bias against acknowledging the achievements of women whose work is attributed to men.
Oh,
And
she's
I'm
like Matilda.
She's Matilda, so instead of calling her
Matilda, right?
Rosalind now, we'll call her Matilda. But this gets us to sort of the heart of the book,
Yeah.
the mystery within the mystery, I guess. Who is Rosalind Franklin? That's the first question. But
Yeah.
this idea that she did all this work and it was stolen, if I can use that phrase.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I had the opportunity to read her friend Anne Sayers, is that how you pronounce it?
Oh my gosh, did you love that book or what?
I did.
I
But
loved it so much.
the interesting thing about that book, and you sort of referred to it earlier, these three male scientists got the Nobel Prize for the work that really
She did.
Rosalind had done.
Yeah.
And the mystery here, and I don't want to go too far because I want our audience to read this book,
Heck yeah.
is that how were these men able to do that?
Right.
And I think there were kind of what I get two ways of approaching scientific research. I'm sure there are many more, but one is the sort of, well, I know what the result is, and so I just have to develop a theory now. And the other is, no, I have to know what the facts are, and then I'll develop my theory. And I think that Rosalind was of the second school of thought. But what prompted us to learn more about the story behind Rosalind and what had happened to her?
What prompted me, or what prompted?
Well, what prompted the world to begin to know, and I think it was Anne Sayers in her book.
Yeah.
And what, maybe get a little bit of history on this, because I
And
think
how this
that
all
is a
happened.
whole, yeah.
Yeah, because to me, it's almost as interesting as Rosalind's story in a way. So, I think we've talked generally about what happened, and because that's kind of important for it, the way in which she labored, utilizing one of the most difficult scientific methods to determine the structure of DNA. Her colleague, Maurice Wilkins, and there's a big story about that, which we can get into, but they had a very acrimonious relationship. And he became very frustrated with Rosalind. He felt like she took it from him, which is really not Rosalind's fault. It was Randall's fault, the guy who ran the lab and then never told anybody. He wanted Rosalind to work under him. So anyway, eventually he became very friendly with two men, Francis Crick and James Watson, who worked at a different lab, in Cambridge. There was a gentleman's agreement between the Cambridge lab and the lab where Rosalind worked, King's College, that the King's College lab was no other lab in England was really supposed to be working on the structure of DNA except for King's College. And the only person at King's College who was really working on it was Rosalind, right? She was the one doing all the hard work, all the gathering the data, proving the structure, right? Maurice Wilkins wanted her to work faster, even though he himself wasn't going to get supposedly the credit for the work. He wanted his lab to win the race to discover the structure of DNA. It was one of those big, juicy questions that was kind of hanging around at that time.
Right.
So he would go to Cambridge and complain about Rosalind to James Watson and Francis Crick. I mean, he loathed her. And Francis Crick and James Watson would slowly kind of eke information about DNA out from Maurice Wilkins. Eventually, even though they had been prohibited from doing so, they built a model without any data, just using what they learned from him and their general sense of what it might be. That model was woefully inadequate, as everyone agreed. Rosalind came and looked at it, Maurice Wilkins came and looked at it, et cetera. So that question of what's the best way to go at it, through the data or just pie in the sky, make a model, seemed to answer itself. Things got worse between Rosalind and Maurice Wilkins, and Maurice invited James Watson to their lab, ostensibly to have drinks at this pub that they used to all like to go to. And at some point, he showed Watson photograph 51, the famous image of the cross, which revealed the double helix. And he was given access to some of the data that Rosalind had compiled, all the measurements that were necessary based on the diffraction of the X-ray beam that showed the sizes and the scope and the scale of the interior. They then built the model, right? And wrote a paper and became famous. As the years went on and Rosalind had moved on and gone to Birkbeck and engaged in a whole bunch of other research, James Watson wrote a now famous autobiography called The Double Helix. This was years later. They had already won the Nobel Prize for this, right? Rosalind already hadn't won the Nobel Prize.
She was deceased at this point.
Deceased by this point, which is a whole other story. But he wrote this book almost like a suspense novel, and it was very popular against all odds. There was a huge backlash among her family, people in the scientific community about the book. And one of the things that most people found loathsome about the book was the way in which he depicted Rosalind Franklin. He depicted her as, as this shrewish, horrific, any stereotype you can think of that time period of a female scientist. And he, in no way, shape, or form, really, at least in the initial drafts, explained what really happened and how beholden they really were to Rosalind. And I personally think the way he depicted Rosalind as he did was a way to deflect from the fact that everybody in the scientific community knew that he got the data from her. You can't build an accurate model without data. And everyone knew that Rosalind had all the data. So there was
weren't they so loathsome as to actually, it seems to be from what I was reading, steal a key to get into her lab to look for her notes. Now this guy Wilson said he had a key because he was assistant director, but she had deliberately locked that lab.
There's things we don't know and things we make jumps, but we do know that however it happened, door open, door locked, he purposely gave Watson access to all that information. Within 6 weeks, they built the model and had the paper.
That's right. She's
been working for years on the data. That autobiography, and this is finally going to get to Anne Sayre, so incensed people in her life that her good friend Anne Sayre, who's a character in the book, and as you alluded to, she wrote her own book because she was so upset at the way Rosalind was depicted, and because she knew that what was in that book wasn't true, that Rosalind was in fact very responsible for the discovery of the double helix. And she was a writer and she planned to go to law school and she wanted to set out to prove it. So she spent several years gathering letters, gathering research information, interviewing every single person involved, Watson, Crick, Wilkins, anybody you could think of. She then, and that book, which refuted this thing that Watson had written, that is what was the spark that gave rise to the interest in Rosalind Franklin as this sort of iconic scientific figure, as the epitome of the Matilda Effect, as somebody who deserved recognition but had been marginalized. And when you think about it, what's really interesting that is if James Watson, who is such a narcissist, an egotist, if he hadn't been so, self-obsessed to write this great tribute to himself in this autobiography, and if he hadn't depicted Rosalind that way, Rosalind might still be unknown today. In a way, he so leads for her becoming famous, and in her way, famous in her way. So
acknowledged and recognized.
Yeah, people wanted to track record. One thing I do want to say, which it was so, I'm in love with that biography by Anne Sayre. It's so, there's just so many things I love about it. And I'm so glad that you read it. I actually was able, and I do talk about this in the author's note. I
don't know if you can see it, but it's a very nice
picture
of Rosalind on the cover.
I love that picture. Yeah. That book is just, it's such a great piece of writing. She filed all of her research materials with the American Society for Microbiology. Everything I mentioned that she gathered is there. During COVID, when everything was shut down, a wonderful librarian there, just talking about libraries, you know how I love them, copied it all for me. So during COVID, I had access to, all these incredible detailed interviews with every single person who's in that book, with Aunt Sarah's commentary. I mean, just for a laugh, you should get it and read the interview with James Watson. It's actually really fun. And there's stuff in there that never made it into the book. And I mean, it was like a treasure trove. And it brought me so close to Rosalind and brought me so close to all the characters in that book in a way that I would have never, ever had. So it's so interesting to think how these after the fact autobiographies, biographies, research are what actually gave spark to her life and actually prompted me to write the book about her.
Well, you get your due eventually. There is one question. I think I know the answer, but our audience may be asking it themselves. Well, why didn't she get the Nobel Prize once all this information came out and it became evident that she was the one who had put this mystery together?
I know. I mean, that's a question that has been put to the Nobel Prize Committee before, but one of the things, the lawyer that I am, I wanted to understand how the Nobel Prize process worked. I really had no idea. And because they actually won, Watson and Crick won the Nobel Prize, and Wilkins too, which really gets under my skin. He got it.
Because 3 people can share, is that correct?
3 people can share. And I have a whole bunch of feelings about that. But the Nobel Prize Committee works, people nominate, other scientists nominate you. And when there kinds of gets to be a critical mass is when the Nobel Prize Committee does its own investigation into the scientist's work, the merits of it, et cetera. And nobody nominated Rosalind for it the year that they won. She had already passed away at that point.
That was 1962, I believe, and she died in 58. Okay.
Right. So it was several years after it. There had been a building sort of interest in it. They didn't become famous right away. It took a while. And so by the time they were nominated, people nominated them, she had passed away. And what's interesting is if you read the Nobel Prize Committee investigation, the independent private investigation, there's some assessment of who did what and how Watson and Crick built the model and wrote the paper. And there's a definite, a few sentences in there saying they definitely had relied on data, to have this specificity. Now, Watson and Crick did sort of add their own flourish, and that's the way the base pairing works. But the bulk of the double helix structure comes from Rosalind's data. And in fact, the Nobel Prize Committee investigator said, it seems to me that Rosalind Franklin is the one who did all the data, right? And then they go on to say, she's passed away, and there seems to be an acknowledgement that King's College, where she worked, deserved some recognition for that. And I think that's why Morris Wilkins got it, because he didn't really work on it at that time. He was a tangential player. So I do think that if she had been alive at the time this happened, I do think she would have stood up for herself. I think others would have stood up for her. And I do think she would have won. It may have been like a little bit of a kerfluffle, a little bit of a fight, but I do think at the end, she wouldn't have allowed herself to go completely unacknowledged for that. But that happened after she passed away. Yes. And there have been people who've said, should they revisit it? I think they should. They've maintained that they don't award Nobel Prizes posthumously. And she had died even at the time they awarded it, right? So it's not like people are saying now, oh, you should give it to her. But she was alive back then. She was not alive at the time. They've just kind of taken that stance. I think this is such an egregious and very, very clear-cut case. There's no gray area here, that it's one of those occasions where they should think about it.
Well, they should at least issue her a commendation. We've had a very lively, sometimes interrupted discussion here today. And Amanda, I wanted to find out if there are any questions for our audience to make sure that they can be heard as well. Are there any, Amanda?
Yes, Judy wrote, Marie, she loves all of your books. She found this one very technical and your research was phenomenal. She's wondering if the book cover artists read the book to help them create the cover images.
Great question. Yes, they do. You know, it's not just me saying, oh, I think we should do a double helix, and they read the book. Sometimes they come up with different and fresh thoughts about how the themes and the characters can be embodied. But yeah, they do read all the books that they design covers for, which I think is so important. And I love that part of it. It's such a different way of expressing ideas and themes than what I do, you know, using words. So it's always fun for me when there's that moment that you're going to get the cover, you know, that they've been working on. I love that.
Thank you so much for that. I don't see any other questions at the moment or anything in the chat. If anyone else has anything they'd like to add or ask Marie, feel free to send something down below.
Well, I can always come up with lots of questions. And the one thing that I was perplexed about was that, and we haven't talked about the cause of Rosalind's death, which was from using all this radiant material, but she was so careful in the lab and how she documented and did every procedure, but yet so sloppy with her personal safety. What was going on there?
You know, it is kind of a mystery, and it's something that it's kind of been hard for me to get my head around. One of the things I did to try and understand her mindset was to research what was known at that time about the effects of radiation, of X-rays. And what I learned was a little bit surprising. I didn't see, certainly they knew that like a very intense exposure could have devastating effects. They mostly knew that from things like some injuries and deaths that happened during the Manhattan Project during World War II. I don't know at that time, I couldn't find any, if there were any long-term studies about smaller doses over a long period of time. I think when faced with something that clear cut, Rosalind would have been, you know, scientist that she would have been it would have been unlikely for her to just turn away from that and ignore it. But I think there was enough gray area about what the impact might be that she felt like most of the people in the lab did just turn a blind eye to it, because, you know, these experiments were, you know, sometimes they took hundreds of hours. You might have invested months into some of these experiments. And sometimes you had to do things at particular times of the day in the cycle in order to continue the experiment. If your dosimeter badge, which shows your, I don't have one on, but like your dosimeter badge, if it would have shown that you had too much radiation and you couldn't go in the lab for a week or two, that experiment that you were conducting, that maybe was the, you know, the culmination of multiple weeks or months of work, you might not be able to tend to it, right? If you were barred from the lab and that was the end of that experiment and you had to revisit it. So, you know, I think if she was so dedicated to her science, I think that if there was enough wiggle room, she wasn't going to let the dosimeter badges and all the different radiation kind of detectors, she wasn't going to let those stop her. And that, quite honestly, was a practice of a lot of scientists at that time. Today, I can only imagine it must be different.
Amanda, I think, did I see a couple more questions come in? I want to make sure.
Yeah, just through the chat, somebody, Judy mentioned actually to you, Mary, that you're the best. And
I agree. I agree.
Thank you.
Leah asked, actually, I don't know if you want to touch on maybe your next project. She asked what amazing woman is next on your list to research.
I'd be happy to talk about that. Well, actually, I have two books coming out next year. I have one in January and one in June of next year. My book that comes out next January is called The Mitford Affair. It's the story of 3 of the 6 Mitford sisters. They were like the aristocratic it girls of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, each more beautiful, brilliant, and eccentric than the next. The story focuses on 3 because we are in the interwar years, in between World War I and World War II, when fascism and communism are both on the rise in Europe and things are becoming tense. 2 of the sisters become enamored with fascism. One marries the head of the British fascism unit in Great Britain, leaves her Guinness heir husband to marry this man. And the other sister moves to Germany, where she becomes basically like the close personal friend and possible mistress of Hitler. Yeah, this is true.
Oh, my.
The other, and this was a time period when Nazis and fascism was in some ways acceptable, especially of the Germanic variety, in the aristocratic circles. As the years went on, one of the sisters started to track the two fascist sisters' movements. That was Nancy Mitford, who became a famous novelist in the years after the war. And she began to see that her sisters were potentially not just obsessed, that they were actually acting against their country. And she had to make some very difficult decisions between loyalty to her country and loyalty to her family. It's really the story of how how seemingly sensible people can be kind of lured into this extreme political movements. And it's a story about how families can be divided due to politics. So it has a lot of modern day resonance without being overtly political about our own time, and kind of allows us to think about and talk about the kind of choices that we have to make, and how that time, much like our own, can be very challenging. Oh,
I think I know what the one is coming out in June of 2023.
Exactly. That book is called, well, right now it's called, I don't know if it'll still be called that, The First Ladies. It's the story of the friendship between Eleanor Roosevelt, who you all know, and Mary McLeod Bethune. For those of you who aren't familiar with her, she was, she was probably the most powerful Black person during the 1920s, 30s, 40s. She was born the child of slaves, 16th, the only one in her family who was not born a slave. And she founded an HBCU, Bethune-Cookman in Florida. And she really founded all these national organizations that fought for equality, and became the only Black female cabinet member, the first under FDR. But the story is so much more than that. These two women were like best friends at a time period when Black and white people weren't even supposed to communicate with each other, and certainly not shake hands or you were forbidden from having meals together. So these two women formed a friendship in the 1920s. They worked behind the scenes to put forward so many of the foundations for the modern civil rights movement, and the legislation that through executive orders that they were able to orchestrate, that started the foundation for integration, because segregation was the law of the land at that time for the most part. So there's so many things that these two women, just fighting with whatever power they had in their possession towards equality for all people. And it's such a moving and powerful story. And that is Victoria and I.
And just to make sure, you have a co-author for this book.
Yes, Victoria,
someone that we may know from these Westerly talks.
My co-author and the personal librarian, my dear friend and co-writer. And for us, it's really been a powerful experience to write it, because, in many ways it's autobiographical for us. It's about how two people, a Black and a white woman, can come together across a divide, and look at the world through each other's eyes and try to make change.
Well, I think you made a promise to me earlier that you—
I don't know about a promise. You know I'm a lawyer too. Don't try to trick me up with that, Mary. But
that you will seriously consider putting on your calendar, coming back to us when your First Ladies, or whatever the title will be, comes out. Because when you and Victoria were here the last time, it was over a year ago, it really enthralled our audience. So we would really love to have you back, and we want to thank you once again. We were a little bit over, but probably that was my fault for keeping us on time. How about that, Amanda?
It's wonderful. You did a great job.
It's such a delight to be with you. And Mary, I got to echo your friend. You're fabulous.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time again to join us. It's been really wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me. Have fun with your friends at 50, and I hope we see each other soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Take care. Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.